A stay of execution from the Supreme Court for hundreds of ostriches on a BC farm, a case that's drawn national and international attention. Plus, a new report confirms that Ottawa is drowning in red ink and that November's budget will come in with a massive deficit. All that and more straight ahead on episode 34 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. All right, greetings, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us. A lot to get to on this episode of the program. There's been a lot happening this week. We'll get to some of the big news out of Ottawa this week with the latest report from the Parliamentary Budget Officer and some bad news in terms of what to expect for a deficit in the upcoming federal budget. Also, some changes coming to Canada Post's mandate. We'll also talk about the ongoing fallout around the federal gun buyback program, which of course is connected to this ban on so-called assault-style weapons. So much more on all of that coming up later on. We got to start this episode, though, with the news out of BC and the focus on this ostrich farm in the Kootenay region of BC, in Edgewood, BC to be exact. Now, this is an ostrich farm that back in December of last year had an outbreak of avian flu. There were 69 ostriches that died as a result of that. Now, resulting from that, as we've seen elsewhere with other farms and other flocks of birds, where the response is to do a mass cull to try to stop the virus from spreading. And look, there's obviously an understandable concern about the spread of avian flu, what it's doing to animal populations, what it's doing to the agriculture industry, and of course the concern that this could mutate further and become a real problem for humans. So the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the CFIA, is understandably taking all of this pretty seriously. But I think there's some concern here maybe that they're going a little too far in their response to the situation on this farm in BC. Because here we are now, September, so more than 9 months after the original outbreak of avian flu, and it doesn't appear as though there's any problem any longer. Yet the CFIA insists on going ahead with the cull and killing the remaining ostriches on this farm, again, nearly 400 of them. So as supporters have flocked to this farm, this case has drawn a lot of attention, even got some response from south of the border, including some Trump administration officials like RFK Jr. Now, look, I don't know if RFK Jr. is doing any cause any favors right now by lending his name to it. But I think there are some legitimate concerns about how all of this is being handled and the question of whether all of these ostriches need to be killed is part of what the CFIA is doing here. And I think maybe one of the reasons it's resonating with people is that the CFIA is just coming across as really just this relentless, heartless, almost power-hungry bureaucracy where they're not listening to any of these concerns. And they almost seem like they're trying to bully this farm into submission and do away with these ostriches. So it's drawn a lot of attention, drawn a lot of support. But importantly, and this is the big thing here, the Supreme Court of Canada has stepped in. Now, the Supreme Court hasn't made a decision on whether this is all legal or whether the CFIA has overstepped its bounds, but it is pretty significant, I would argue, that the CFIA has now been told by the Supreme Court to wait. The Supreme Court of Canada has issued a stay regarding this cull, so for now, it cannot proceed. Now, that may soon change. We'll see where this all goes from here, but a pretty significant development regarding this whole situation, and one that could set some precedent moving forward in how the CFIA and federal officials deal with this whole situation. So joining us for some further perspective and insight on some of the legal issues at play here and some of the concerns about animal welfare as well, very pleased to welcome to the program here Camille Labchuk, who's a lawyer, executive director with Animal Justice. Animaljustice.ca is their website. Camille, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
It's great to be here, Rob.
So I guess the significance here of the Supreme Court's intervention, if we can call it that, we don't know how ultimately they might decide on this case, but just the fact that they heard this, they issued a stay, what do we read into that?
Well, let's talk about some legal drama. That was an 11th hour decision, staying the execution of those ostriches, the likes of which I have not personally seen before. Honestly, animal law cases rarely make it to the Supreme Court, and certainly not in this sort of emergency fashion. So it was very, very interesting to watch. Ultimately, what the Supreme Court said is what was consistent with what the Federal Court of Appeal and also the Federal Court have both done, which was grant a stay of proceedings or a stay of the order of execution while they fully considered the case. Now, if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. The case has to be fully briefed with written materials filed and arguments from counsel. And if the birds were killed and the order was executed before that occurred, that would just not be fair to the birds or the parties. So the Supreme Court's essentially saying the same thing. They're saying, let's put a pause on this for now. But they are saying as well that they do want to hear this case very quickly. I believe the parties have been ordered to have all their materials filed within about a week. And it seems like the Supreme Court will decide it on an expedited, more quick basis.
How important is it then that we get some legal clarity, not just with the specifics of this case, but how the CFIA can proceed in other cases? Because, look, clearly there's concern about the impact of avian flu, but that's not a blank check for the CFIA either.
Well, the Health of Animals Act, which is the statute under which the CFIA is operating, it does grant that agency very broad discretion. And they are empowered to take various steps that they see fit to respond to avian influenza as a threat in ways that they decide are appropriate. That doesn't mean that everybody else gets to agree with the ways that they decide are appropriate, but it does empower them to make a lot of decisions. And the courts typically are loath to step in and intrude upon that jurisdiction and review CFI decisions. So that's what we saw the federal court say. That's what we saw the Federal Court of Appeal say. I do think it's important that this is litigated. I think it's important that this case has reached the public consciousness and reminded people that there are actually lives at stake here. This is not just some academic exercise about the CFIA making decisions, but there are individual animals whose lives hang in the balance. I can tell you there have been millions of chickens and turkeys and other birds who've already been culled by the CFIA over the past couple years because of bird flu, and their lives didn't attract the same degree of attention. So I think it's a really good thing that we are having this conversation now about the ostriches, because the CFIA, I can guarantee you, will be engaging in similar steps in other bird flu cases when they do break out.
Right. And maybe it's the fact that it's ostriches in this case. Maybe that's one of the reasons why this has resonated with people. But I think there's just also the fact that it feels heavy-handed. This was a situation that goes back to late last year. Here we are now, what 9 months later, and the idea that these 400 birds need to die. I mean, I think it's left some people wondering whether this is going a little bit too far. What do you make of that?
I think it's raising a lot of questions for people, for sure. And you're right. The fact that ostriches are massive, big birds with obvious personalities, obvious sentience and intelligence, I think that's why they've connected with people more than a barn full of chickens typically does. But whatever the reason be, people are now asking these questions. So birds, as you mentioned in the intro, they were infected back in December. We've got to assume at this point that whatever infections they've had have cleared up. The CFIA said in court documents that retesting the birds and doing further examinations is against their policies. But to me, that actually seems absurd. What is the point of killing these birds 9 months later? It seems to me like it's just a fight over jurisdiction. And I don't see why birds should have to suffer and die. And make no mistake, they will suffer as they die. It's very difficult to kill animals humanely. No matter how which animals they are, how they're being treated. It's difficult to carry out an extermination on that scale, especially when the animals don't want to die. So the fact that birds should have to suffer and die just so the CFIA can prove a point about its jurisdiction, to me, doesn't seem right.
No, and further to that, I mean, the word cull just sounds so innocuous, but there is a process here. And I know there's been some concern raised about how this is done or to whom the CFIA is reaching out to do this on their behalf. And especially with animals like ostriches, what do people need to know about what would go into this?
Yeah, you're right. They do use very sanitary language like cull or depopulation to describe what they plan to do to the birds, but it's exterminating them. And it's often pretty brutal. So Animal Justice actually did a pretty large access to information investigation into previous bird culls associated with avian influenza. And we got thousands of pages of government documents over the past couple of years. And what we found was the CFIA using just appalling methods to kill birds. They gassed chickens and turkeys in homemade gas chambers that didn't function very effectively. They attempted to use a nitrogen-based foam to suffocate birds. They did a test on that. It didn't work very well. The birds were still alive for the most part, and they obviously suffered. And we just saw really, really other unfortunate methods. So I don't have a lot of trust in the CFIA to carry out this quote-unquote cull humanely. We also saw that they engaged a company named Elite Farm Services. Elite had previously been convicted for animal cruelty, for abusing chickens. The CFIA prosecuted them in the past for chicken abuse during transport. So the fact that they would then be looking to this company to help them carry out depopulations or culls of birds, to me, is really troubling. So I don't have a lot of trust in the CFIA's ability to do this in a way that doesn't cause quite a lot of suffering to these ostriches.
Right. The idea about allowing testing, and the CFIA seems pretty against that, but that almost seems like a reasonable compromise here, because I don't think anyone really wants to see avian flu running amok. Does that seem like a reasonable course of action at this point? Could that be done?
It does seem like it could be done, and it's been really surprising to me that the CFIA hasn't addressed that publicly. I think their communication strategy on this has been about as bad as the rest of their strategy on it, but we haven't heard a response from them about that. I know the ostrich farm has tried to adduce new evidence into the case to show that the birds are doing well now, and the courts haven't so far allowed that evidence to be in there. So I feel like we're operating in a deficit of information, and that if we simply could get into a better place with more information, the CFIA could potentially make a better decision. To be honest with you, Rob, I thought that this whole time when the CFIA was defending against this case, that what they were doing sort of made sense because they had to defend their jurisdiction. They wanted to protect their ability to carry out culls if they deemed them necessary. But I never thought that they would win and then still decide to kill the birds because of the passage of time. So it really does feel at this point like they're just trying to make a point.
Right. And not every call can or should go to the Supreme Court of Canada, clearly. But what do you hope can come of this then? And maybe at least clarifying the CFIA's powers here, the situations where they need to intervene or should maybe not intervene?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely they need to revise whatever policies they've got on the books that says that they're not going to bother retesting birds. If the circumstances change, then the policies and their procedures should change as well. That seems really obvious to me, and I think it seems really obvious to anyone that's watching this case, which is that there's no point in killing healthy birds. It really feels like they're punishing the birds just because they survived this horrible sickness. So what is the point there? I also just think it's a really good time to be having a broader conversation about bird flu and the factory farming system. We have to remember that the reason the CFIA is so hell-bent on exterminating these birds in the first place is because they're given the mandate to protect factory farming from disease outbreaks. Factory farming, I think, is something that most of us don't support when we start to hear the details about it, but it involves cramming hundreds of thousands sometimes of birds into tiny sheds where they don't get to see sunlight, they don't get to experience anything natural, and their lives are miserable and short. So if that's the system that we're protecting by carrying out this ostrich kill, I hope that starts, having people raise questions in their mind about why we're doing this.
Right. Yeah, because this farm in BC certainly wouldn't meet that description. This is kind of the opposite of factory farming.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like the ostriches have outdoor access, which is good. I want to be clear, the ostrich farm has killed birds in the past. It's not that they're not exploiting them or using them for profit. They've been, I think, a little less than clear in the court documents about the uses for which the birds are being put. But, when you look at these 400 incredible, sentient, intelligent birds, should they have to die just because the CFA wants to protect their jurisdiction? I think most people would say no.
And should that factor in, what they're processing and what they're going through, even this whole situation with these crowds and these drones and everything else? Does the CFIA need to take that into consideration, do you think?
Well, they certainly should be. I've been really troubled. I've been checking out some of the live streams from the ostrich farm, and I've seen low-flying drones. It seems like the government agencies were flying drones over the ostriches for some purpose. What that is, I don't know, and it seems like that did spook the birds. Obviously, the birds are experiencing at this point potentially dozens of unfamiliar people in their habitat where they live. You've got to imagine that's stressful for them. It seems like really just a very intense, busy situation that can't be good for the birds. I think when you consider how these are massive, massive birds, it's really hard to kill an animal humanely. I will say, even in the slaughterhouse where they try to introduce regulations to make that happen, a lot of the time animals still suffer significantly. And one of the reasons it's so difficult is because animals don't want to die. They want to live. They want to protect their lives. These ostriches are like any other animal, and that's compounded by the fact that they're so big. So you think about how you could actually possibly capture an ostrich, kill that bird humanely without causing a lot of suffering, it becomes a real, real problem. So the situation on the ground right now for the farm, I see, is very troubling.
Right. And I mean, ultimately, I suppose the CFIA would argue that they're trying to prevent more of this down the road. If there were no avian flu, then they wouldn't have to do any of this. So we understand why there's a mandate to try to get ahead of this situation. We don't want this to get out of hand. We certainly don't want to see, spill over to the human population. But is there a better balance that could be found here?
Yeah, and there are some infectious disease experts, veterinary infectious disease experts, who have also pointed out that at this point, avian flu is endemic. It's not that we're going to be able to stop it from spreading amongst wild populations of birds. We just can't do that. The cat or bird is out of the bag, so to speak. So is there really any value to killing these birds who have likely recovered from avian influenza? I think the answer is just clearly no.
Yeah. We'll see what comes of this case. Much more, as mentioned, animaljustice.ca. Camille, appreciate your perspective and insight on this. Thanks so much for joining us here.
Glad to be here.
All right, once again, that was Camille Labchuk, a lawyer, executive director with Animal Justice, animaljustice.ca. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens here, what the Supreme Court ultimately decides to do with this case, what it means moving forward for this farm, obviously, and these 400 or so ostriches that are there, and also elsewhere as the CFIA continues to deal with and respond to avian flu outbreaks, because we are going to see them. I think, as Camille said, this is kind of endemic now. So it does become a question that if we just run around the country just culling herd after herd, does that make the problem go away? So maybe another way to deal with all of this. But look, at the same time, you don't want this festering. You don't want this spreading more than it needs to. And yeah, there is that concern that the more animal populations it can spread through, the more it can possibly mutate and, perhaps pose a bigger threat to humans. So that is the concern. But I think maybe all of this can be perhaps better balanced by the CFIA. We'll see what happens. Coming up in just a moment, we're going to talk about the federal finances and a new report out from the Parliamentary Budget Officer that paints a bit of a bleak picture looking ahead to the budget that is going to be tabled on November 4th. The PBO's report confirms that the deficit this year is going to be a lot bigger than expected. Debt is climbing. Debt-to-GDP ratio is going in the wrong direction. Not a pretty picture. We're going to hear from Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, up next on the Rob Breakenridge Show. We are just over a month away from a federal budget finally being tabled, but if today's report from the Parliamentary Budget Officer is any indication, it's not going to be a pretty picture when it comes to red ink. A deficit last year that was just over $50 billion, pushing now $70 billion, 68.5. That's not even factoring in what is promised in terms of some big new defense spending. Debt to GDP ratio is going in the wrong direction. So joining us to talk about what this report tells us and how the federal government maybe needs to respond. Very pleased to welcome to the program here Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, taxpayer.com. Franco, thank you so much for joining us here.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me on, man.
Like I say, not a pretty picture in this report, but at least, gives us a bit of a warning of what we're dealing with, maybe, an opportunity here to try to get ahead of this. But what stands out to you, first of all?
Well, I just got to say, this is a really bad picture, right? This is really, really bad. And I'm really worried about this, Rob, right? You mentioned the massive deficit, almost $70 billion this year. The government is borrowing tens of billions of dollars every single year. And one of the biggest worrying signs that I see is actually the debt interest charges. And not just how much it's costing us today, where this year debt interest charges will blow a $55 billion hole in the government's budget. Right, that's more than $1 billion every week. Well, Rob, what's $1 billion? That's a brand new hospital that isn't getting built every week across Canada because of these interest charges. But if you look at the forecast from the PBO down the road, interest charges are going to hit $82 billion in 2030. We're talking about the alarm bells need to be ringing in the Prime Minister's office, because this report shows just how bad of a situation we're in right now.
Well, and to put that in perspective, to talk about how much debt's accumulating and what we pay every year just to service that debt, what we saw under Justin Trudeau was a considerable amount of borrowing and a rise in that debt. But based on this report, we might blow past that in just the next 4 years here.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Let's go back to the Trudeau era for just a quick second. When when he first became prime minister, the debt stood around $616 billion. In a matter of 10 years, it doubled, more than doubled, to now we're looking at about 1.3 trillion. So think about that, right? All of the years of Canada's history leading up to 2015, the government racked up 600 billion. In 10 years, the Trudeau government doubled that to 600 billion. Now, the concerning part moving forward is this. So I think it's fair to say that Carney, sold Canadians during the last election on this idea that he was different than the former prime minister. Well, if you look at the debt, he is different than the former prime minister. He's actually worse, according to everything that we know right now. Look, the PBO report shows that Carney is going to add $255 billion to the debt over the next 4 years. That's about $100 billion more than what even Trudeau was planning to do.
Yeah. And I mentioned that, this debt to GDP ratio, which the government has held up as, to say, hey, don't worry too much about all this borrowing and these deficits. They could at least point to that and say that was declining, but that's no longer the case here, is it?
No, it's going up, right? It's projected to increase from 41% to 43% and essentially stay there. And what's really worrying about that is that you're seeing the debt make up more and more of our economy. And Rob, I don't need to tell you what happens with this prolonged trade war that goes on. What happens if we enter a recession, right? A bad one. Well, then our debt just spirals out of control. And we've seen this song and dance happen before in Canada, where we've been put in a really bad spot. And this is why I always say, look, the best time to put out a fire is when it's just smoking, right? You don't wait for that smoke to then engulf the entire kitchen. That's when you're in a really bad spot. And I think if Mr. Carney doesn't get serious about righting past wrongs, if he keeps borrowing, if he keeps spending, we're in for a world of pain here in Canada.
Well, it's interesting the way they're framing this budget, and it sort of speaks to some budget maneuvering maybe that this prime minister is going to do and try to separate operational and capital spending, this idea that we can somehow have both austerity and investment. What do you make of those signals here?
Well, you can't. And look, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we've been very critical of, former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the way that he was spending, right? A lot of people have, and we were definitely one of them. But look, the problem with Trudeau's budget wasn't how the budget was laid out, right? There's longstanding principles that the government of Canada uses to account for capital spending in its budget every year. That wasn't the problem with Trudeau's budgeting. The problem, if I could just be so blunt, was the debt-fueled spending spree, right? Before the pandemic, when the government was spending all-time highs, even after accounting for inflation and population growth, then the massive increase of spending, including non-COVID related things during the pandemic, and then after the pandemic. So that was the main problem that Trudeau's budgets had, was the out-of-control spending. It wasn't, how the budget was laid out or what they're calling spending, operating, or capital. That was not the problem.
So what does this government need to look at? Because as you say, there's been all kinds of spending increases. There's plenty of places I would imagine they could start here. But what's the course of action that's necessary here, do you think?
Well, number one, we've heard a lot about this spending review, but it's very narrow. It doesn't focus on the entire budget. And after a decade of out-of-control spending, finding savings in every area of the budget should be like finding water in the ocean. We actually have to look at every single area of spending. Nothing should be left off the table. Number two, let's talk a little bit about the waste, some of the infuriating stuff, right? $100,000 studying the life of a grocery cart, an $8 million barn at Rideau Hall. That's the infuriating stuff. But what the government actually has to look at is the bigger cost items. And the number one cost on day-to-day spending is the bureaucracy. There's just no way around it, right? The government added 99,000 extra bureaucrats in a decade, ballooned the cost of the bureaucracy 77% since 2016, right? It's consuming 55% of the operating budget. So there's no way around it. The Carney government has to fire some bureaucrats.
What about on the revenue side? The Carney government did come in and they eliminated the consumer carbon tax, although that wasn't necessarily going into general revenue. They backed away on the capital gains tax changes. But I just wonder, the situation I think would probably preclude this government from going any further with some needed tax reform. But what about the concern maybe that things go the other way, that this government looks at the revenue side as opposed to the spending side?
Well, that's a tale as old as history, right? When governments go massively into debt, when they run up these huge deficits, that's always the big concern, that politicians start to flip over all of the couch cushions looking for new ways to take more of your money. You mentioned the capital gains tax hike. Well, the capital gains tax hike came along, A, as a political wedge, right? They tried to wedge the opposition party on it. But B, it was also a way to try to paper over their massive spending spree. So this is always a concern. Rob, let me just go back a little bit to our conversation we just had earlier about debt to GDP, right? With all of the economic issues that we're facing, the Carney government can't be raising taxes, right? Like, let's look at the International Tax Competitiveness Index that compares 38 OECD countries. We're ranked 31st out of 38 on individual tax competitiveness. That's awful. We're ranked 26th, on business tax competitiveness. Again, awful. We're ranked behind the United States on both measures. So we got to grow the economy, and that definitely means no tax hikes.
Well, November 4th is Budget Day. We'll see what the government has in store and whether they take anything from this report here and these warnings. Much more is mentioned, taxpayer.com. Franco, thank you so much for making some time for us here.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me on.
All right, once again, that was Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, reacting to this report from the Parliamentary Budget Officer. Again, we'll see November 4th is when the budget comes down, what this deficit actually looks like, and whether it's simple to discern what the budget's deficit is. It sounds like the federal government's going to try this little kind of accounting trick. You might recall Alberta did this for a little while. We sort of separate operational spending from capital spending, and you can make the deficit look a little more modest when you split it up that way. But ultimately, money in, money out. I mean, that's kind of how it goes. So November 4th is when we'll get the budget. And of course, the government needs to get it passed. I mean, I don't think this is going to bring down the government. I don't think anybody wants an election. But where does that leave the NDP? Maybe the Bloc would be fine supporting the budget for now. I think it's going to be a little more awkward for the Conservatives to support it. We're talking about this kind of borrowing. So the report came out on Thursday, made for an interesting exchange, an almost somewhat amusing exchange Thursday on question period between Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre and Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne. Here's that exchange.
This Prime Minister is more expensive than even Justin Trudeau. Wow. The PBO reports that the deficit is now 2/3 higher than the one Trudeau left behind. Over the next 5 years, this Prime Minister will add an amazing $300 billion of additional inflationary debt, twice what Trudeau would have added, all of which will add to the cost of living for Canadians. Why is it? How is it possible that any Prime Minister could have been more expensive than Trudeau?
Honourable Finance Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me start by wishing the mother of the Leader of the Opposition happy birthday. And I'm sure that she's looking at the TV today, Mr. Speaker. Question. I have good news for his mother, Mr. Speaker. We cut our taxes, Mr. Speaker, along with 22 million Canadians. I don't know his mother, Mr. Speaker, but I know in her heart she must be proud of this Liberal government. That we cut taxes, that we're fighting for families, that we're going to build the country of the 21st century. Let's celebrate, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I can confirm he definitely does not know my mother. In fact, my mother knew how to budget better than anyone. She could stretch a dollar farther. In fact, I think she should come in here as the finance...
All right, so that was Thursday in the House of Commons. Of course, as mentioned, budget comes down on November 4th. There's a lot going on in Ottawa this week. A couple of the stories we'll get to. The latest on what's going on with Canada Post as that becomes just a bigger and bigger financial mess. The federal government is finally taking some steps to deal with it, some modest steps and things we should have done. And in fact, we're planning to do about a decade ago. We'll get the latest on that. And, of course, the whole fallout on the federal gun buyback that we talked about on the last podcast. Of course, part of the whole ban on so-called assault-style weapons. So we'll get the latest on that as well. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. We've done a couple of episodes on this podcast focusing on Canada Post and what the future holds for Canada Post and whether it can have a future if it continues in its current form. The Crown Corporation is losing massive amounts of money. Now, following the labor dispute at Canada Post, of course, earlier this year, we had the Industrial Inquiry Commission, and they came to a pretty stark conclusion. The Canada Post is facing an existential crisis. It is basically insolvent or bankrupt, and it's going to continue to lose money. Look, I think there's a pretty strong case for privatizing Canada Post, as we've talked about before, but certainly the status quo can't be an option. So in the face of that, the federal government taking some reasonable steps to try to address that. And frankly, we could have been a lot further along if this had been done a decade ago, because one of the reforms that the Conservatives under Stephen Harper were attempting to implement was ending home delivery and having community mailboxes, which could at least save not an insignificant amount of money either. But of course, the Trudeau Liberals came in, they canceled that transition. So you've got the bulk of the country, majority of the country, using these super boxes, but you've still got a smaller segment that gets home delivery. So starting right there, ending home delivery would be an obvious place to start. So the federal government is doing that. It's going to allow for some other restructuring at Canada Post, which could include closing some post offices in different parts of the country, which again would make sense. So look, these are modest steps. I don't know if this is going to be enough to save Canada Post. Probably not. But here's the problem in doing any of this. Even modest steps to try to address the financial bleeding at Canada Post are being met with vehement opposition from the union. The Canadian Union of Postal Workers, just honestly to me, I'm sorry to say, just seems in complete denial. They're completely oblivious to all of these realities, thinking we can just keep on going like we've been going before. That's just not the reality. So honestly, if we're going to get to a point where we sell off and privatize Canada Post, I think, ironically, CUPW and their intransigence on all of this is just going to expedite all of that. Here we are Thursday night recording this podcast. The changes announced earlier in the day by the federal government. Now CUPW has said as they are, quote, outraged and appalled by the changes and are now calling for a cross-country strike. How do they think this is going to play with people? Look, honestly, for a lot of Canadians, Canada Post is kind of irrelevant anyway. But as we saw with previous labor disruptions, it does have an impact on businesses. Canada Post does still have a monopoly in certain areas. So if they're off the job, that can affect businesses. And it will affect some Canadians. But they really think the Canadians are going to be sympathetic of the union here in all of this? I don't think these are going to seem like controversial changes to most Canadians, honestly, especially given the amount of money that Canada Post is losing. So CUPW's response to this is to go on strike, which I don't think is going to help them in the long run. We'll see. But this was earlier on Thursday, as the announcement about some changes at Canada Post was being made by Public Works Minister Joel Lightbound. Here's some of what he had to say.
So the bottom line is this. Canada Post is effectively insolvent. It provides an essential service to Canadians, and in particular to rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. And Canadians are rightfully attached to it and want it saved. However, repeated bailouts from the federal government are not the solution. So where do we go from here? In its report of May 15, the Industrial Inquiry Commission, led by William Kaplan, addressed these challenges and provided a path forward. And today, I'm announcing that we're accepting all of the recommendations directed to the government by William Kaplan in its report. I'm instructing Canada Post to introduce flexibilities in their delivery standards. The government is removing the moratorium on the conversion to community mailboxes. 3/4 of Canadians already receive mail through community, apartment, or rural mailboxes, while 1/4 still receive door-to-door delivery. It's an expensive service, and by way of example, delivering mail to an individual address costs the corporation $279 a year, whereas delivering mail to a community mailbox costs $157 a year. As such, I'm authorizing Canada Post to introduce community mailboxes to approximately 4 million more addresses.
Right, so that was the minister announcing what, to me, again, are pretty modest changes. So the idea that this is somehow a hill to die on, the vast majority of Canadians already using these community mailboxes or super boxes, and yet we need to try to preserve home delivery for these other 4 million addresses at a cost of hundreds of $millions a year. It makes no sense. But again, the union's going to strike because the government's moving down this path. It seems crazy to me. Ultimately, we need much bigger changes and reform at Canada Post. Honestly, probably privatization. And if even just these little modest changes are going to provoke this kind of reaction, I don't know how we make any change. So we'll keep an eye on how that story unfolds. But I guess now it looks like postal workers are going to go on strike. And will the government back down, or how do we get out of this mess? I guess we'll have to wait and see. Now, the other story, of course, this week, the federal government is moving ahead with its controversial gun buyback program, which is a part of this whole convoluted ban on so-called assault-style weapons, which is just fundamentally flawed because we don't really have a good workable definition of what constitutes an assault-style weapon, which is part of a big reason why this whole thing is a mess. We've got some semi-automatic rifles that do count, others that don't, even those that are more or less the same. And I think, unfortunately, for a lot of firearms owners, it's very confusing just knowing what they have and whether or not that constitutes an assault-style weapon and what they're supposed to do. So we talked about this on the last podcast. The federal public safety minister caught on tape inadvertently acknowledging all of the problems with this gun buyback program, that it's going to be unworkable. It's not really going to accomplish a whole lot. And yet they're pressing ahead with it anyway. One of the things to be concerned about here, though, I think, because it sounds like the money is going to be capped at what they're willing to spend on this. When you take the money they're prepared to spend compared to the number of firearms that are out there, like it's going to run out at some point. And what happens then? So a lot of questions about how this is all going to work. And then you've also got the fact that across the country, there's not a lot of appetite for helping the federal government do this. Certainly here in Alberta, the Alberta government, again, making it very clear this week, they want no part of this. They are not going to lift a finger to cooperate with the federal government to implement this buyback program. And if there are legal ways, they can perhaps interfere even to some degree. It sounds like they're even prepared to do that. But certainly, look, I think it's reasonable for Alberta or any other province to say, look, don't look to us for any help, certainly not any financial help in implementing this, because this is just a flawed approach in so many respects. So if Ottawa thinks they need to do this, then they can figure it out. But I think, in a way, the public safety minister was right. This really isn't going to work. I think there's some internal politics going on here. I think the prime minister is trying to keep all various factions and bases within his party happy. And so he's decided he's going to stick with this. He's been willing to abandon or distance himself from other Trudeau-era policies. But I guess he's decided this is one he's got to stick by. And as the minister was acknowledging on tape, there's a big Quebec factor here, which I guess matters to the Liberal Party of Canada. So we're getting this expensive, flawed policy, whether we like it or not, whether we need it or not. So this was Wednesday in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister was in the House, and the Conservative leader focusing on this issue. Here's some of the exchange between Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney on the gun buyback.
The minister has admitted that going after farmers and hunters hunt rifles is not going to fight crime. So the only reason to do this is politics. If he was telling the truth, then why not reverse? If not, why isn't he fired?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the gun registry, what the government is doing with the gun registry is putting in place a much more efficient way, an efficient way for Canadians to voluntarily return prohibited firearms, for fair compensation. This government is going to do it right.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
But his own Minister of Public Safety says this government is doing it wrong. He was caught on tape saying the program won't work, and yet they are going to rip $750 million away from our border and police services to harass duck hunters and farmers by banning the firearms they use. This approach has led to a 130% increase in gun crime under the Liberals' watch. The police say they won't implement it. The minister says it's a bad idea, but they're only doing it for political reasons. Why is the Prime Minister putting lives at risk for politics?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I don't even know where to begin with that.
That's right.
First off, I don't know where to begin because of all the misrepresentations in that intervention.
That's right.
The person who's putting lives at risk is the Leader of the Opposition who's voted against every single piece of gun legislation. What the Minister of Public Safety is doing it right. He's correcting an inefficient system to provide Canadians with fair...
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I have voted against the Liberal policy of reducing criminal sentences for those who use guns to commit extortion, to commit robbery, and to commit other serious offences, while voting in favour of locking up criminals who use guns in the commission of crime. The police say that 90% of crime is done with guns that come illegally over the broken Liberal border. The Liberal Public Safety Minister admits that the Prime Minister is only playing politics. Will the Prime Minister stop the politics, fire the Minister, and leave Grandpa Joe's hunting rifle alone?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Once again, Mr. Speaker, I will have too little time to address all the issues, but let me go back to something the Leader of the Opposition said, which he described farmers, duck hunters using AR-15s to hunt. I don't see that. I don't see that in my great province of Alberta. I also know that what the Minister of Public Safety and this government are doing is tightening the border. Bill C2, will the opposition stand up and support the tightening of the border?
Good question.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
And there, the Prime Minister just admitted that he doesn't even know what his gun ban applies to. That's right. For example, this gun ban applies to 10 and 12 gauge shotguns, which are used by the great people of Alberta and all Canadians for duck hunting. It applies to 70 22 caliber firearms that are used by almost every farmer to go after gophers. Will the Prime Minister stop wasting money banning gopher guns, read his briefing notes so that he knows what he's talking about, and fire that incompetent minister?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what this government is doing is providing fair compensation for Canadians to return illegal firearms, illegal assault rifles, and what this government is doing is proposing the biggest tightening of our border in our nation's history. We want the support of the opposition to make sure that happens.
All right, again, so a lot of questions about how this is all going to work, what it means for gun owners in the rest of the country, when all of this is supposed to take effect, how much this is all going to cost, who's going to be implementing this, what are gun owners supposed to do with their now illegal firearms, send them somewhere, drop them off somewhere. It's a mess, an expensive mess. And again, we'll see what happens there. Listen, that's where we got to leave it for this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Coming up for you next week, a conversation with Michael Binion. He's a member of the Alberta Next panel, which is holding its final in-person town hall next week. He's also CEO of Questair Energy and executive director and founder of the Modern Miracle Network. But he's written an interesting new paper on where Alberta has some room to assert itself legally and constitutionally. It's called How the West Wins, Alberta's Legal Pathway to Greater Power Within Canada, which obviously ties into a lot of what the Alberta Next panel is doing. Also, author JDM Stewart, we're going to talk to him about his new book. It's called The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. Fascinating new book. We'll have that conversation for you coming up in our next episode as well. You can find us, robbreakenridge.ca. Thanks for joining us here. Have a great weekend, folks, and we'll talk to you on Tuesday. Take care.